Contrary to popular belief, the Sami people live far beyond Lapland. In fact, the majority of Norwegian Sami reside in Oslo. But seriously, the Sami have traditionally lived throughout most of Norway, except for the very south and southwest. The Southern Sami, for instance, live in Trondelag, and they speak a distinct Southern Sami language, which is unintelligible to Northern Sami speakers. In the village of Trondelag, where I stayed for a while, there were only 2 Sami families who roamed the mountains with their reindeer once a year. Sometimes, they would send their children down to the village to buy food. One of those Sami families owned a sawmill in the village. The man's name was Lasse. His name was unmistakably Norwegian. I met him in the village reading room, and he invited me to his mountain for a beer. We hopped on his snowmobile and traveled for a long while until we arrived at a pair of tents surrounded by reindeer. There was not a tree in sight. The snow was so blindingly white I almost could not see, but Lasse lent me his sunglasses. In one tent, he kept all sorts of provisions, and it was cold. In the second tent, where he lived with his family, the warmth was almost like a bathhouse. Soon, he was planning to leave, but for a while, we just sat in the tent, sipping beer. He was a man of a few words. Even in the library we barely talked. We simply sat there, drinking, staring at the box of beer that served as our table. 3 hours passed, and I started wondering why I had agreed to come all the way out here for this awkward beer session. Finally, he took me back to my village, giving me a piece of venison as a parting gift. He remarked that I was a good guy for being able to drink silently. He added that his only constant company was his wife and 2 young sons. Without a proper goodbye, he left. In June of that same year, 2018, I decided to go fishing for salmon trout at a mountain waterfall. The place was high up, so there were no trees, and snow lingered in most places. Few people knew that salmon trout lived so high, so only locals ventured there, and even they did not go often, since the wind was harsh and cold. It was just my luck that the rain had caused a surge in the salmon trout population, and they were swarming in the waterfall. Having caught a bucketful, I decided to rest and drink some cognac to warm up. As I settled down, wrapped in a sheepskin, I suddenly noticed a bearded man in ragged clothes running toward me, shouting something and waving his arms. He approached quickly and spoke with a heavy Sami accent, urging me to hurry down the mountain. "There's a snowstorm coming," he warned. I was immediately surprised. What kind of snowstorm happens in June? Moreover, Sami people in Trondelag had long since stopped speaking with such an accent, and even the homeless in Trondheim did not wear rags like that. But what could I do? I wrapped up my fishing rod and cognac in the sheepskin, grabbed the bucket of salmon, and reluctantly followed the men. When I asked who he was and what the storm was about, he did not respond. Not even a minute passed before the wind picked up and the drizzle turned into snow. Soon, I could not see further than an outstretched arm. The men motioned for me to follow, and we walked for about 20 minutes, but rather than heading downhill, we moved along the slope. I could not object. The wind drowned out my words, and there was no one else to rely on except for this strange figure. Besides, he seemed to know about the storm in advance. Suddenly, he shouted over the wind, "We've arrived." I couldn't figure out where we had arrived. After stumbling forward another couple of meters, I saw a barn door, completely invisible until that moment. How had this man been able to find his way when we could not even see the barn from 2 meters away? We managed to stumble inside, and there was nothing but a bare floor. I spread out the sheepskin, we sat down, and I thanked the Sami man for saving me, offering him some cognac. I had always placed the wall side of the sheepskin facing up, as a matter of habit, but he looked at me oddly and commented in broken Norwegian, "You, Dara, non-Sami, are big weirdos. Who would spread skins with the wool facing up? Both reindeer and sheep wear wool on themselves to stay warm. Have you ever seen a reindeer or a sheep with the wool inside?" It struck me then. Lasse had spread the skin in his tent with the wool facing down. I realized that the wool protects the skin from the moisture of the earth, keeping it dry. The man, whom I now knew was Sami, did not answer any more of my questions. At first, he would not even tell me his name, but eventually introduced himself as Mons Piasso. The storm died down, and the sun began to break through a crack in the barn wall. With difficulty, we opened up the door, now covered with snow, and stepped outside. The snow was so blindingly bright, it was hard to tell which way was up or down. Thankfully, I still had lost his sunglasses. I thanked Mons Piasso again, and we parted ways. That winter, I ran into Lasse again as he stopped by to check on his sawmill. I told him the story about the strange Sami man I had met. I asked him who the man was. He thought for a moment and said, "There are no Sami on that mountain. There never have been. The place is too windy." Then, after a long pause, he added, "It was my great-grandfather you met. His name was Magnus Peterson. He died there in his 40s, caught in a snowstorm while delivering provisions to the partisans." He nodded thoughtfully, and without another word, he left. I am not good at green text, but I want to share this local story from my homeland. Be me, an 8-year-old Norwegian kid. I'm on a Sunday hike with my family, 'cause that's what Norwegians do. We get to a small hunting cabin right by a lake. It's old as hell. Uncle gathers up the kids and says, "Do you know why that cabin is abandoned?" The kids don't know anything, so we just shake our heads. Because Huldra haunts this lake. Huldra are a type of Norwegian fae/troll. Think the Norwegian version of a siren. Looks like a beautiful woman, but has a bovine tail. Pick related. Apparently, 100 years ago, there were 3 buddies. They want to go out hunting deer. They agree to meet at the hunter's cabin. The first guy arrives on time. He realizes that none of his buddies are there. He has to wait for them. The second dude arrives the next night. The first guy is missing. He searches the whole place, only finding his bag and his jacket floating in the lake. I guess he drowned. He notes it down in the cabin log and waits for the third guy. The third guy arrives the next day. No one is at the cabin. He searches the whole place, only finding his friend's bags and the second guy's jacket floating in the lake. Something is off. He reads the cabin log. He figures the Huldra must be behind this. It's getting dark. It's way too late to go home. The third hunter keeps himself awake. He doesn't light a fire as to not alert the Huldra of his presence. He starts cutting the back of his hand to stay awake in the dark. Suddenly, he hears a sound from outside. The hunter is quiet. He is clutching his knife, knowing cold iron can be used to negate fey magic. He slowly stands up and gets next to the door. He's listening, hoping it's just a fox or something. He hears the noise again. It's the sound of someone sneaking towards the cabin. I am not going to get attacked by a horny troll wench. The hunter kicks the door open, throwing the knife at the shadow and books it into the woods. Since then, the cabin has been abandoned. Be 17-year-old me. On another Sunday hike with just Uncle and Dad, because that is what Norwegians do. We get to a small hunting cabin by the lake again. The thing has almost entirely rotted away. My uncle asks, "Did I ever tell you what actually happened at the cabin?" I shake my head. My uncle tells me that during World War II, the cabin was a meeting spot for Gutta Paskauen. Translation, the boys in the woods, the Norwegian resistance fighters. Mostly used by a communist subsection of the Norwegian resistance. Someone in the local community really did not like communists. They started snitching to the Nazis. Nazis set up camp close to the cabin. They straight up just shoot whoever enters the cabin. In the end, word gets out and the cabin stops being used. Be me, sitting there realizing that I'm sitting on the spot where my fellow countrymen got executed. I don't know if the Huldra story was made as a kid-friendly version of the tale to not ruin the spot for us kids, or if it was made as some form of code passed around the farms to keep resistance fighters away from the cabin. Pick related. It is of the lake. I knew a journalist who specialized in writing about forgotten historical figures. I often helped her with organizing and translating Soviet documents, especially when she worked on stories about white émigrés in Norway, or the heroes of the Great Patriotic War who fought in northern Norway. Then, she stumbled upon the incredible story of a Ukrainian partisan named Rambovsky. This Ukrainian Rambo had been captured by the Nazis and brought to Norway to help build roads alongside Soviet and Serbian prisoners, but he managed to escape, acquire a weapon, and began fighting as a partisan in the forests. He had no knowledge of the area, and for 3 years, he hid right near a German military base. Neither the Germans nor Rambowski knew of each other's presence. He also did not hear the news of the war's end, and the information did not reach the Germans in that remote wilderness for some time. On May 12, 1945, a German patrol finally caught him, but he escaped again into the forest, taking 2 rifles from the Germans in the process. That evening, those same Germans learned about the war's end. To their shock, a mysterious submarine arrived from the shore and took Rambowski away in an unknown direction, an event witnessed by local peasants. While the Germans eventually made their way to Argentina, as historical record suggests, the locals believe the Germans instead hid in Antarctica, constructing flying saucers. The story took another strange turn. In the summer of 1945, Rambowski was found sleeping in a peasant's barn, captured and sent to a mental hospital, where he later died. To this day, locals tell their children that Rambowski will come for them if they stray too far in the forest, taking them off to Russia. While assisting the journalist with the story, I accompanied her to a local farm where a peasant had delivered food to Rambowski. On our way, we stopped in a larger village to get some water. We decided to take a break and smoke in a picturesque meadow, surrounded by about 50 brown cows, just outside of the village. In the middle of the meadow stood a small hill covered with fir trees. Around the hill, we could see the remnants of a fence with barbed wire. Curiously, a deer stood still near the bushes, watching us. The cows did not seem to notice us at all. The deer eventually disappeared into the thicket, crawling through a hole in the fence and slowly walking into the forest. We followed it through the hole and found ourselves in the woods. There, standing alone, was a vertical stone with runes etched into it. It wasn't particularly unusual. There are plenty of such rune stones in Scandinavia. However, this one had been fenced off, probably to protect it from vandals who might damage the stone, as had happened in the past when drunk teenagers lit fires near these sites. But I had never seen archaeological finds protected with barbed wire before. I also could not find any reference to this runestone, not even the most detailed archaeological maps. The hill that it stood on was likely a Viking burial mound. After spending some time with the stone, we returned to the car, planning to walk to the village to get some water. We needed a break from the drive, but strangely, as soon as we saw the runestone, we began feeling unwell. The village was strange too. Even though it was a weekday, both the store and the gas station were closed, with no notes explaining why. Typically, in Norway, establishments put up a sign with their reasons for being closed, whether it's an ordinary holiday like May Day or an emergency. But here, there was nothing. The streets were eerily empty. No people, no cyclists, not even passing cars. There were no birds either. All the house windows were covered with curtains. We knocked on a few doors to ask for water, but no one answered. Growing uneasy, we quickly left the village. As we reached the meadow by the hill, we were shocked to find that the cows, at least 50 of them, had disappeared. Where could they have gone in the mere 10 minutes we had been away? We hurried back to the car and drove to the farm, where the owner told us more about Rambowski. Afterward, we asked if he had noticed any oddities in the neighboring village. He gave us a strange look, shook his head, and seemed genuinely puzzled by our questions. We left the farm by a different route, bypassing the strange village altogether. In the north of Norway, while working as a gardener in a cemetery for a couple of weeks, I heard from gravediggers about a mysterious incident that happened a year before the Second World War. After a storm, a corpse washed up on the shore. 2 local guys came up to it and identified it. It was a fisherman from a nearby fjord. The fisherman's name was Stian Sæther. They decided to call the adults to transport him to the church cemetery or to call the police. The nearest police station is still a long way away, as is the cemetery where I was working. They temporarily dragged the fisherman's corpse to the edge of the coastal forest. We returned there with the adults an hour later and saw a completely different corpse lying nearby, also at the edge of the forest, in torn, very old-fashioned clothes. And besides, it had decomposed and stank terribly, so that you could not even see its face. Corpses, of course, do not know how to change clothes, and they can't decompose in an hour, especially since it was cold and cloudy. You could have thought that the seagulls had mutilated the corpse, but the seagulls had not yet flown in for dinner, and the seagulls could not change the corpse's clothes. In general, the adults did not understand what the hell was going on. They decided that the kids had mixed something up. The body was taken away. Stian, as it turned out later, had disappeared after all. The police, without thinking twice, solved the problem simply. Buried the found body, and write on the tombstone that it was, they say, Stian, although it was clear to everyone that it was not him at all. Only one old man believed the guys, said that such a phenomenon often happens if a corpse drowned in the sea ends up near the forest. Then a Draugr emerges from the sea, a type of zombie, a drowned man who takes corpses back to the sea and either eats them or sends them to hell or makes new Draugrs out of them. And to meet the Draugr, a Schlapp emerges from the forest, an ordinary zombie who wanders through the forest and also collects human corpses. If the Schlapp died a long time ago, then he is dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and the Draugr, as a rule, is generally dressed in mud with shells. And so, the Draugr and the Schlapp begin an epic battle to decide whose corpse it is. The Draugr, of course, believes that the drowned man's corpse is his, and the Schlapp, the bastard, claims that since the corpse is on the edge of the forest, it belongs on land. That time, apparently, the Draugr won, killed the Schlapp, and dragged the fisherman's corpse back to the sea, and the Schlapp's corpse was left lying on the edge of the forest, and it was this that the adults found. No one showed me the grave, but while trimming the bushes in the very corner of the cemetery, where nothing had been done for a long time, I discovered a tombstone, overgrown with lichen, on which I was able to make out the inscription, Here lies Stian, a brave fisherman who died in a storm. I was unable to make out the date, but, as I have already said, he died before the start of the war, and the spelling on the tombstone belonged to the same period. Hey, hope you've enjoyed the story so far. If you want to hear more, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment because it lets YouTube know you like the content and helps more people to see these videos. My next big goal for the channel is 100,000 subscribers, and as a celebration, I will be doing a Q&A video once we hit that goal. Thank you, and back to the stories. The action takes place in northern Telemark in the dead of winter. My friends and I were sitting by a fire in the forest, drinking moonshine and baking potatoes as we argued about politics. Lost in the conversation, we did not notice at first that we were hearing voices coming from the forest right behind us. We assumed that locals were skiing through the woods and might join us soon. The voices were male, coming from about 200 meters away. We could not make out what they were saying, but the sounds became increasingly strange, like school children mocking one another. Laughter, roars, grumbling, and shouting echoed through the night. But, like idiots, we kept chatting, dismissing it as nothing more than some drunken local skiing through the forest without flashlights. Eventually, the realization hit us. It was already 3 in the morning, and something about the situation did not seem right. I suddenly remembered the stories of the Tusse, mysterious underground creatures that occasionally surface for various reasons. These creatures were said to be too weak to kill, but could bite your leg, or, in extreme cases, steal a child and replace it with one of their own. Sometimes they were described as ordinary people dressed in blue. Following the advice of the Norwegian elders, I poured some moonshine onto the ground behind me and quietly said something like, "Here is a gift for you, now leave us alone." The moment I did, the voices immediately stopped, but my friends were still unsettled, and it was getting late, so we decided to head back home. The next day, we returned to the area to investigate. We walked around the forest where the voices had come from, but found no signs of people in the snow. Later, the locals told us that sometimes smoke could be seen rising from that part of the forest, but when anyone went to check, the smoke would vanish. The locals believed that people lived there, but no one had ever seen them. A couple of years later, I witnessed something strange. I saw the forest owner, chainsaw in hand, cutting down pine trees to build a bathhouse. Before starting, he shouted, "Beware of falling trees." When I asked him who he was warning, he simply replied, "In my family, it's customary to warn the Tusse, and then continue cutting the tree as if nothing happened." Here is another story connected to the Tusse. A farmer near Stavanger shared this tale with me. I worked in his barn and spent the night there once. Every week, He poured a can of beer onto the ground behind the barn, telling me he would explain why later. To be honest, I was glad he told me the story only when I was about to leave. Otherwise, I would not have dared to stay there. But my naive brain convinced me that it was just the ramblings of an eccentric farmer. This happened in the 90s. The farmer had been drinking at the pub and was walking home late at night. Things were not going well for him. His wife had left him, taxes were mounting, milk prices were low. As he stumbled home, a strange group of individuals approached him. Men with enormous noses, warts, crooked eyes, and toad-like mouths. They spoke in an archaic way, though they didn't have the typical local lisp. Nieuwstevanje, everyone has that. They invited him for a drink, claiming a neighbor had just moved into a dugout nearby and was having a housewarming party. The farmer thought this was odd, but drunk as he was, he followed them. They walked to what appeared to be a huge dugout, filled with raucous sounds of violins and people celebrating. There had never been a dugout in that area, though, and the farmer thought it was strange, but did not question it. The men assured him that they had recently moved in. They were his new neighbors, they said. The farmer agreed to join them for a drink. Inside, the dugout was full of even more grotesque people. Some were lying on the floor, vomiting, others were fighting, and a musician was playing a cacophonous tune on the violin. The air reeked of filth and vomit, and a massive sword with a golden handle hung on the wall. Despite the chaos, the farmer thought that they might be some kind of religious sect. He told himself that if they were drinking, they must be alright, so he joined them. Then, something dripped from the ceiling onto him. He sniffed. It was urine. The men told him it was normal. The dugout was built in a mound under his barn, which was why cow urine dripped from the ceiling. The next thing he knew, the farmer woke up face down in the barn, surrounded only by cows and pigs. It was morning. He was not particularly scared. In his drunken state, he assumed it was some sort of devilry. From then on, he started pouring a can of beer on that mound every week to keep the Tusse happy. According to him, his fortunes improved dramatically after that. He became the richest farmer in the village and remarried the most beautiful girl in the area. Later, he explained to me that the sword with the golden handle probably belonged to a Viking buried beneath the barn, and he did not want to disturb it. He had no interest in the sword. It was better to leave the Tusses alone than risk upsetting them. He refused to allow archaeologists anywhere near his farm. I did not doubt his tale. I come from the Urals myself, and my great-grandmother used to leave offerings at Truchki burial mounds, icons, porridge, kvass, and she would incense them with slowly burning pine cones instead of using incense. I understood this folk belief, and found that such stories are surprisingly similar across cultures. Probably the most incredible story that ever happened to me, and one I sometimes wonder if I should even mention, involved a friend of mine from work. Let's call him Niels. At the time, I worked in the fishing port of a small village between Bergen and Trondheim, located on a rocky island. I spent 3 springs working there consecutively. The island was primarily inhabited by fishermen, but there were also more Poles, Lithuanians, Siberians, and Belarusians working in the port than Norwegians. Then, the port burned down, and now only the local alcoholic fishermen remain. The island itself is grey and unremarkable, except for the presence of Viking burial mounds. Once there was a quarry there, but it went bankrupt back in the 80s. The only beautiful spot is one particular beach where, on Easter, the sea becomes an emerald color and the water warms up enough to swim for hours, but that only happens on Easter. Niels was like the island, unremarkable, grey and stooped, but with a deep love for moonshine. He was a local, though he grew up in the mountains. In his youth, he was friends with Varg Vikernes, who would come and visit him at his cabin, since their parents knew each other. But they eventually fell out, as Niels described Varg as a whiner who always complained about life. He said he would kick Varg out in the middle of the night sometimes, just to let him go skiing in the winter or cycling in the summer, hoping it would calm him down. Having learned of my interest in history, Niels once showed me a stone in the basement of his house. The stone was about the size of a football and resembled a type of ancient artifact. I knew such stones were found by archaeologists throughout Norway, but I was taken aback when Niels told me that his late grandfather had once offered it various treats: booze, grease, tar, and even chicken blood. He had taught Niels' mother how to perform these rituals, although she had never followed them, instead hiding the stone in the basement. Niels explained that his grandfather believed that these were Christian rituals, and the stone supposedly came from the site where St. Olaf had died. He said it was a sacred family heirloom passed down through generations, and one should never speak of it lightly. But that's not the main part of the story. One day, after a long day's work, we were sitting in a village pub. There was no hostility between the locals and the Eastern European migrant workers, but due to language barriers, Norwegians usually sat together, while the migrant workers kept to their own groups. Being of indeterminate nationality, I had the freedom to sit wherever I liked, and that day, I sat with the Norwegians. Niels then began telling us an interesting story. He said he had won the lottery and decided to visit London. He hung out in pubs, got thoroughly drunk, and one evening, when he was not too far gone, he found himself lost. An hour later, he found himself on the other side of the city, which seemed impossible to do on foot in such a short time. He made his way toward the city centre and decided to climb over an iron fence. Suddenly, he found himself on the roof of one of the extensions of Buckingham Palace. He even showed me a photo, but it was so dark that I could not make out any of the details. However, another colleague who frequently visited London confirmed that the view in the photo was from Buckingham Palace. Again, this was a considerable distance from the outskirts of London to Buckingham Palace. Niels could not climb back up, so he decided to climb down a pipe. It wasn't high, and acting calm and casual like a worker at the palace, he simply walked out through the main gate, passing the guards in their tall hats. And it worked. The next day, he was expelled from London because he had completely lost his mind from drinking. He had stripped naked, stolen someone's jeep, crashed into a kiosk on the outskirts, and demanded that the vendor give him free cigarettes, declaring that England had once been ruled by the Vikings, and he had come to restore the ancient glory. When Niels told us about his time at Buckingham Palace, he was so drunk that it seemed impossible to believe. At first, I thought he might have just gotten incredibly lost. The following working day, he denied saying any of it. We all laughed, calling him a master of making up stories. The only one who still seemed to believe he was not lying was that same London specialist who had confirmed the view in the photo. But the story took a bizarre turn the next evening. As I was preparing to leave, Niels called me back to the entrance of the port and quietly said, "Okay, I really did end up at Buckingham Palace, but don't tell anyone. Do you want me to show you a magic trick before you go? Just don't tell anyone." He disappeared around the corner of the port building, and a couple of seconds later, he appeared around the corner of another building in the distance, effectively teleporting. I did not understand what happened at first. I was just finishing my last cigarette when I saw Niels reappear at a distance, and then, when Niels was already out of sight, I realized what I had just witnessed: teleportation. I stood there, dumbfounded, for a long time, though nothing truly terrible had happened. I had just witnessed something that defied all reason. The next morning, I sailed back to the mainland and never returned to the island. I never saw Niels again. To this day, I am convinced that I should not trust my eyes in situations like that. I've come to believe that Niels was simply a magician and a storyteller, though a small part of me still wonders, what if he really could teleport? And could this strange ability somehow be connected to the family heirloom in his basement? P.S. I do not use illegal substances. I have no idea what I saw. I was having trouble finding a place to live again, so I took a weekend job at an old man's bucket shop. In return, he let me sleep in his attic. Besides making buckets, the old man sometimes worked at a private gold mine in the Trondelag Mountains. He told me all sorts of stories about a gold-bearing river where he used to pan for gold. For him though, prospecting was more of a hobby. He and his crew lost way more money than they ever found. The river runs through remote, mountainous terrain. It's so out of the way that, according to locals, people were still using runes there 100 years ago. The mining crew worked in the river's upper reaches, but their camp was at the river mouth, deep in the forest. Even there, the river is shallow. You could wade across it without getting your knees wet. The base had all kinds of makeshift setups to help them relax after spending all day waist deep in icy water. I remember two in particular. One was a bath in the middle of the forest, where they would just build a fire under it to heat the water. The other was a short, cleared slope they used for skiing in the winter. The strange stuff started happening when they were still setting up the camp. One of the guys kept losing his things. At first, they thought there was a kleptomaniac among them, but soon it became obvious that things were vanishing from everyone, and it was costing them real money. The weirdest part was that stuff would disappear even when no one was at the base. It couldn't have been thieves either. There were no houses nearby, and no one could have snuck in by car or on foot without being noticed. Also, whenever someone walked alone up the river to the mine, they would get disoriented and wander off course until nightfall. That should not even be possible. The terrain is open tundra, and if you were following the riverbank, you literally could not get lost. But somehow, the bank would vanish, and the prospector would end up somewhere totally unfamiliar. Thankfully, no one ever went missing for good. The guys were so committed that they even panned for gold in winter. They would cut holes in the ice and work with fires going nearby. The winters there are surprisingly calm, little wind, so it was not quite as suicidal as it sounds. Good gear and heated pants helped too. Still, one day they dragged sleds full of firewood up the river, and both the sleds and the wood just vanished. No one was scared, just pissed. Every fall, strange sounds, screams, groans, low mumbling, came from the mountaintop at night. Most blamed animals, but one old-timer said his parents had told him witches used to hold Sabbaths up there. Still, if that were true, you would expect to see firelight, and no one ever did. Even so, the youngest guys in the group got spooked and quit. The old man told me once that he climbed the mountain himself after the first snow. Not out of curiosity, he just wanted to take in the tundra landscape. At the top, he saw huge footprints in the snow, like something the size of an elephant had passed through. It scared him enough to run back down, though he never told the others, afraid they would think he was crazy. Another time, one of the guys was skiing down the slope one winter evening. Darkness falls fast in those parts, but he seemed to enjoy skiing in the cold and dark. As he went down the hill, he saw two white figures running uphill from the side. He could not stop in time to get a good look, and when he got to the bottom and turned back, there was no one on the slope. At first, he thought his friends were pranking him, but it turned out that all of them were still in the kitchen tent, and none of them had been wearing white. In spring, the team headed back upriver to the mine. It was cold and foggy. The locals call that kind of thick mist scada. Then, across the river, they saw a shepherd's hut in the fog. No one had ever seen it before, and there definitely was not supposed to be any hut in that area. They crossed the river to check it out, but as they got closer, the fog thickened and the hut vanished. A few seconds later, the fog lifted and the landscape was exactly the same, just with no hut anywhere. And then there was the storm. One day, everything was calm, sun shining, butterflies fluttering. Then, within seconds, it started pouring rain and lightning cracked through the sky. But weirdly, there was no wind. The shallow little river swelled into a roaring flood, washing out almost the entire base. The tents somehow were not touched. The ski slope collapsed into a mudslide. The bathtub, some equipment, and a few cars got swept away. Then, as fast as it came, it all stopped. The area near the mouth of the river has been flooded ever since. Despite all of this, the group did not even consider giving up. They bought new equipment, relocated the camp, and kept right on prospecting. They even found and repaired the cars that had floated off. The river had not carried them more than 10 meters away. The bathtub, though, was not found until the month I worked with the old man. They discovered it miles downstream, deep in the woods, balanced on top of a pine tree. And keep in mind, during the storm, there had not been any wind.